Hello everybody, welcome to my first video, and what a way to kick off the channel. Of all games to be my first review, The Last of Us 2. It's perfect however, because there is plenty for me to talk about, and I mean plenty. Anyway, I greatly appreciate you checking this video out, and I sincerely hope you enjoy it. Let's begin. Now, as a disclaimer, I will try to keep spoilers to a minimum, but for sure one thing I'll be spoiling is the identity of the protagonist. If you don't want that to be spoiled, watch this video when you're ready. Some people like to watch reviews retrospectively after they beat a game, and I'm one of those people, so no hard feelings. Let's start with what I think is the strongest component of the game.
It's not gonna work. It's completely covered in snow.
Nah, by the time we get there, this whole area will be thawed. Where are you going?
Needed some air.
This here is where the game truly shines. Attention to detail is unmatched. You will see the pores on people's skin, the hair on their head looks and moves realistically. The acting, the facial expressions, and the motion capture all come together to deliver tense and powerful story moments. Wounds turn into scars throughout the game. Blood spills, it spatters. Limbs are dismembered in explosions. Guns sound powerful and look authentic. The water also looks great, probably the best in the biz so far. When it rains heavy, water will flow downhill in tiny rivers and down characters' faces. Shorelines have waves crashing, foaming up on the sand before receding back into the ocean. The list goes on and on. I'm going to spend the least amount of time on this component of the game simply because I think it's the most obvious. Everyone knows The Last of Us as a series is always going to be the industry leader in graphics. So obviously by far this is the strongest component of the game.
Oh shit!
Gameplay in The Last of Us 2 is quite strong as well. Combat is satisfying when things go well. Looting sections along with puzzles break up the pace nicely, rewarding you for exploring nooks and crannies. There are safes with combinations that you have to figure out by solving riddles, and there are collectibles as well to be found throughout the map. Shooting is satisfying overall, particularly when you nail those critical shots. You have a good variety of tools and methods with which to approach many situations. It's incredibly satisfying when you think of a plan in your head, then execute it, defeating your enemies nice and clean. You could also take out whoever you need in the moment and slip back into stealth if you're discovered. Enemy AI has been touched up as well. Enemies call out each other's names when they go down. They call out where you're at to their teammates and constantly try to flank you to keep you on your toes. Not to mention when they die, they let out these traumatizing screams, occasionally even making a last stand to tell you some choice words. My gripes with the gameplay are not huge, but they got in the way a little bit. I'm not a huge fan of the reticle and the weapon sway. It can sometimes feel exaggerated, almost cheap when you're aiming right at someone and you miss, especially if it's in a pivotal moment and you're low on ammo. Thankfully, it gets better with weapon upgrades and new skills. Another thing is the way in which you equip your weapon. It's with the D-pad and it's real time. The way it's arranged can be confusing if you're in the middle of a heated battle, and it can cost you sometimes. Basically, you're gonna have to learn exactly where everything is on the D-pad. So you got the bottles on the bottom, you have health kits and traps on the top, sidearms on the right, and the long guns on the left. However, I simply think a weapon wheel could have been a better method here. In addition to that, the stealth takedowns have very little to no variety. On top of that, they take incredibly long. One stealth kill lasts up to 9 or 10 seconds. And when it's the same animation every single time, it makes going full stealth kinda boring. The previous game was the same, and I'm not sure why they couldn't add some more variety to these takedowns. To be fair, you're not supposed to focus on one style of playing. The game plays best when you're mixing up stealth, shooting, hand-to-hand combat, and crafting on the fly. Now, this next thing is a bit of preference, but I feel for such a grounded game, the skill upgrades are still a bit gamey. Somehow you learn new skills by finding training manuals and pills? Now, The Last of Us 1 was the same in this regard, so I'm not sure why they couldn't innovate a little bit. Maybe find a more realistic, grounded way of upgrading your skills. To sum it up, the gameplay of The Last of Us 2 is really good. The puzzles are good with some new twists and some old, but not revolutionary. Looting and crafting is good, but it's quite the same as well. Shooting and combat are great, the best part when you master them, but also quite the same as the last game, with the exception of the hand-to-hand animations.
He's there.
Let's get off the roof before someone sees us.
Here is the trickiest part for me to review in this minimum spoiler video. The Last of Us 2 is a very complex and deep narrative attempting to tackle all sorts of social issues, some of which you may be interested, some you may not be interested in, which is completely fine. The developers knew their game would be divisive and controversial. They took a huge risk, which in and of itself is commendable, but in my honest opinion, it was not the kind of story that speaks to me. It may be for others, and if it is, I'm happy for you. To explain without spoiling too much, I didn't find myself liking the protagonist along with many characters. For example, Ellie I did not particularly like, even from the first game. I always found her to be a bit bratty and antagonistic to one of the people who taught her so much and cared for her, Joel. Unfortunately, they did her no favors in my opinion with this game. She's not as bratty as she's grown up a bit, but she's every bit as bitter and standoffish towards people who just want to help her. In addition, there are likable characters that die and are barely ever mentioned again or grieved for. It's almost as if the writers know who you like, and they kill them off unceremoniously with no warning, which was very off-putting. There are also moments where the game attempts to defend heinous acts with little to no reason or time to process. The excuse of, we gotta keep moving, we just gotta go, seems to mean, it's alright, just forget about it, just move on. Important characters die, which really bothered me for very specific reasons that I can't mention. Lastly, the ending was not satisfying to me. There were a couple loose ends that were never tied up, some very main story loose ends, others more side story loose ends. Basically, the story is deep and there is a lot to it. It has very high peaks in the form of intense standoffs where you don't know what's going to happen or who's going to be taken out, not to mention the acting and the production quality. It's great. Unfortunately, the low valleys come in the form of an indulgence of violence with almost no justification, no time to process, and no time to grieve. The unlikable characters getting all the screen time and the likable characters being mistreated, even killed. The social issues, which you may or may not be interested in, were unfortunately not for me, and that's okay. Everyone is entitled to their opinion, and there are people who might like the game. Perhaps I was just not the developer's target audience. However, these things do affect the experience I had with the game, and so it did affect the score. Let me say that for this final verdict, I really had to think a lot. The graphics of The Last of Us 2 are downright incredible. The gameplay was improved in subtle ways. There is enough freshness to enjoy, but ultimately it plays almost identical to the first game. The story is hit or miss depending on what your interests are and how strong your attachment is to the characters of the first game. My final verdict for The Last of Us Part 2 is a very, very high 7 out of 10. To break it down, I feel like the gameplay being more or less the same and slightly clunky at times brought it down 1 point. Then the disinterest I felt with the main characters, the social themes along with the wanton violence and the unsatisfying ending ultimately brought it down another 2 points. Now, I feel it's quite difficult to recommend this game simply because it's so divisive and controversial. This is by admission of the developers. They knew this game would be this way, that it would separate people and make them take a side. So to recommend this game, it would have to be to someone who is either interested in the social themes or to someone who isn't interested in them but is able to get through those things and just enjoy the game itself. Even with fans of the first game, it may be a hit or miss, as certain key events early on in the game may make or break it for you, mostly if you have a very strong emotional attachment to characters of the first Last of Us. In other words, I feel like I have to recommend this game to people I know well enough to fall within the categories I just mentioned. I can't quite recommend this game at large simply because of how divisive. But I can say there is plenty bang for your buck. It's a longer game than the previous one, and the quality of the actual game, like the actual game and the gameplay, is definitely there to satisfy you in the grand scheme of things. So that's all, folks. I'd like to thank you for checking out this video. I hope you enjoyed it. This was a minimum spoiler review, so I didn't want to talk so much about the story, but I will have an exclusive extended spoiler discussion and analysis of The Last of Us Part 2 on my Patreon page for my patrons. That is where I'll be discussing exactly what I didn't like about the story, what I did like. So if you're interested in checking it out and supporting what I'm doing, head over to my Patreon page at All's Will. Now, this is the very start of my journey as a content creator. I do want to apologize for the lack of quality. I am working with very limited software at the moment, but I do expect it to be getting better soon. I simply didn't want to keep putting this off and waiting any longer. I also just wanted to get my thoughts out there. I have seen a lot of overwhelming love and a lot of overwhelming hate for the game. So I just wanted to come in and give a bit more of a balanced take on the game. It's definitely not a 0 out of 10, but I also think it's not a 10 out of 10. Anyway, this has been my review of The Last of Us 2. I hope to see you on my next video. Goodbye, everyone.